Hello, this is Brad Carmack. I'm the author of Homosexuality, A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You can read my book in soft copy by downloading it for free from bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You may also obtain a hard copy by emailing me at homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. We've talked in previous clips that, again, this is making a moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. We've covered 8 reasons so far. We're now going to start with reason 9, which is that we can't be 100% certain that we know God's thoughts on same-sex marriage yet. Okay, so we've talked about 8 reasons to support a strong moral case for LDS same-sex marriage. We're now going to be on number 9. So the claim is that by some that the church will never perform same-sex marriages because God has sexual intercourse with his wife and that God has offspring. And the implication is that same-sex couples cannot mimic a heterosexually married God in this way, although opposite-sex heterosexual-oriented couples can. Now, it doesn't seem to me that a lot has been revealed about the mechanism of spiritual reproduction or God's sex life at all. And certainly the idea of reproducing spiritually as we do here on earth causes one to scratch one's head a little bit, considering the vast number of God's offspring, and it just seems it would be an obscene amount of sex required to have a number of sexual episodes for each birth multiplied by the number of offspring that we know God to have. Is a pretty incredible amount of sex to organize intelligences into spirits. Now, also we know that here on earth we're pretty close to having the ability to give same-sex couples the reproductive capacity through reproductive technologies. It seems that if we're close to it here on earth, there's little doubt that in heaven, omnipotent persons are capable of the comparable task of spiritual reproduction. An example would be, we know that God created our bodies from the dust of the earth. This process seems very different than sexual intercourse, and it seems that we can increasingly follow his example through the use of reproductive technologies, and that perhaps following his example would be difficult to condemn on a moral case. But irrespective of those arguments, the use of reproductive technologies, etc., there's an insufficient revelatory basis to support the contention that homosexual couples can't mimic God's method of spiritual reproduction. If we don't know that mechanism, we can't know that same-sex couples would be incapable of it. And in fact, the literal spiritual parentage of God can even potentially argue against same-sex marriage, absent a knowledge of how spirits are reproduced. A second argument along these lines is, even if God is heterosexually married, he's either exclusively monogamous or he's polygamous. Okay, so he's either got one wives or many, in which case to become like him, we would ostensibly each have to mimic him, meaning that in eternity, if he's monogamous, we'll all have to be monogamous. If he's polygamous, we'll all have to be polygamous. Well, over time, there's been a number of faithful followers who have been either monogamous or polygynous. So one or the other of those camps has some significant changing to do. If, however, on the other hand, God permits a diversity or a pluralistic sort of forms of marriage in heaven, meaning monogamous or polygynous relationships that were entered into under his authority are both deemed valid, then there's no necessary conclusion of same-sex pairings. There's indeed the possibility of exalted same-sex couples extant in the universe right now. We don't have any revelation to the contrary on that subject. I'm not aware of any to the affirmative either, but the possibility exists, and indeed is not entirely unlikely if God tolerates in heaven a diversity of marriage forms. Now, we also have to be careful about the conclusions that we make based on our own presumptions or cultural upbringing. There was a study done that asked a number of individuals what their thoughts were on same-sex marriage, basically either opposing or favoring same-sex marriage. And then they were asked if they would be willing to submit the matter to God in prayer and ask what God's thoughts were on the subject. And so the individuals did so, and of the 68% of their participants who believed they had assessed the will of God, every single person found that God agreed with their stance on same-sex marriage. So all those who personally opposed same-sex marriage reported that God agreed with them and also opposed same-sex marriage. Everyone that favored same-sex marriage also reported that God agreed with them, and none of them found that God took a compromise position. So those who personally favored same-sex marriage found that God favored it. Those who opposed found that God also opposed, and it turned out that God did not disagree with any of the participants' beliefs, even though obviously they are in conflict. It seems unlikely that an individual can both oppose and favor same-sex marriage. And so we do need to be somewhat careful in our beliefs in thinking that God agrees with us, and instead we should be more interested in finding and making ourselves to agree with God. Joseph Smith said, "Why be so certain that you comprehend the things of God when all things with you are so uncertain?" And when we ask God to reveal truth, we've got to be willing and open to listen to whatever answer he gives, even if it contradicts what we thought we knew. If we're not open to God's answers, there's little point in asking him for answers. Okay. Now again, that reason, as well as this next one, is not necessarily an argument in favor of same-sex marriage, but it's an argument that we should be open, to the possibility of God supporting same-sex marriage. The other reasons would be more affirmative in support of the proposal. So reason number 9 is we can't be 100% sure that we know God's thoughts on same-sex marriage. Reason number 10, saying that we should be open to the ideas, that very few open members stay active. And this is also a reason that argues in favor of LDS same-sex marriage. There seems to be a lot of homosexual-oriented members that leave the church, more so than non-homosexual-oriented members. It's very difficult to find the exact percentage. I asked a number of people to try to find out what percentage of people leave the church by, say, the age they're 40 or 50 that are homosexual-oriented. I got a number of responses, of course, none of them entirely reliable or conclusive. It says, as for people who stay active 100% years after they come out, I'd say 5% of the people I know. A lot of people I know said and promised that they would stay active, but they don't, ever. And it's not that they go apostate, it's more like the church isn't a healthy place to live for them, and they part ways for a few years or decades until things get better between them, end quote. Gary Watts, he was the former president of Family Fellowship. It's a predominant LDS support group for families who have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender members of their families. He says that less than 10% stay in the church. I'm not sure if this is accurate. I would imagine it's somewhere in the ballpark. And I, for one, find it devastating that this many homosexual-oriented members are leaving the church. I love the church, and I want and hope that it is a place, since the gospel is for all people, that the church is for all people, that the restored gospel of Jesus Christ is for all people, and I hope that that would include homosexual-oriented members. But the fact that so many are leaving is one piece of evidence that the LDS environment is inhospitable to those who are open about their homosexual orientation. And if there really is nothing that's evil or sinful about being homosexual oriented, there seems to be little reason to criticize the act of coming out. And obviously to tolerate or advocate same-sex marriage as a church is likely to make the LDS environment more hospitable to those who do come out, and probably those who are in the closet as well. And it seems also likely that proselyting efforts to homosexual-oriented people and their loyal loved ones could be more successful with than without LDS same-sex marriage. But in addition to losing fewer homosexual-oriented members to apostasy or suicide, there would be less people that leave the church over this issue. I knew a new convert who I had a long conversation with, both in person and over email, who was very troubled by this issue and the church's stance in opposition to same-sex marriage. And despite my efforts to try to persuade her, in the end she didn't understand, and she left the church. And there are a number of stories like this. So that's another reason in favor of LDS same-sex marriage, is to lose fewer homosexual-oriented members and their loyal family members, and to gain more through proselytizing efforts. Okay, so let's move on to reason number 11. Reason number 11 says that LDS divine command theory relies on living oracles. Okay, so divine command theory is a form of ethical reasoning, and basically says that the most predominant duty that we have is whatever God commands. There's a quote by B.H. Roberts. He says the following: Mormonism calls for thoughtful disciples who will not be content with merely repeating some of its truths, but will develop its truths. The disciples of Mormonism will yet take profounder and broader views of the great doctrines committed to the church, and will cast them in new formulas, cooperating in the works of the Spirit until they help to give to the truth received a more forceful expression and carry it beyond the earlier and cruder stages of its development. Okay, and I think that he expressed an important principle there, that we need thoughtful disciples who will develop the truths of Mormonism. Now, we believe in the church that the words of living prophets trump the words of dead ones. This living over the dead principle can be a wonderful and unfortunate thing. For example, if you look at some of President Kimball's teachings in 1968 to 1971 about homosexuality, they unquestionably create a psychological living hell for many homosexual-oriented members in the 1970s. In Chapter 2, and in an earlier video, we concluded that homosexual orientation, or I concluded rather, is in most cases predominantly caused by biological factors, such as genes and prenatal hormones. So homosexual orientation is, at least if that's true, roughly morally equivalent to being left-handed. There's really nothing morally wrong with being left-handed or being homosexually oriented, since neither one is agentic or chosen. Certainly there should only be culpability attached to those things which we choose, not things that we're born with or that are outside of our control. And a lot of times people who listen to President Kimball's teachings during that period and other leaders, they falsely condemn themselves for choosing to be left-handed in a world in which such handedness is effective to God by comparison, choosing to be homosexually oriented. But today we have more authoritative statements that are recent. President Hinckley in 1997 recognized a moral difference between orientation and conduct. And so we don't have to apply President Kimball's repeated characterizations of homosexually-oriented people as self-selected perversions. We're not required or obligated to do that anymore because President Hinckley's statement trumps his. President Hinckley says, "Now we have gays in the church, good people. We take no action against such people, provided they don't become involved in sexual transgression." Okay? So this living over the dead principle in the church can be a very fortunate thing. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of the statements by church leaders about homosexuality and the morality of homosexual conduct and orientation over time. There's one scholar that said, "Reaching adulthood in the 20th century, this is the 1900s, seemed to be the crucial factor in the decline of tolerance among LDS leaders for homoerotic behaviors and the rise of homophobia within the Mormon hierarchy since the early 1950s. Okay, so earlier on in church history, there was a greater tolerance of homoerotic activities, and there was also less homophobia. But then, as the apostles reached adulthood later in the 20th century rather than in the 19th, there was a decline in that tolerance. He also said that despite newspaper reports of sexual activities among Mormon students since the early 1900s, for decades, some LDS administrators and Mormon teenagers showed no homophobia. In Pioneer, Utah, sodomy wasn't illegal. For instance, Mormon municipal judge Jeter Clinton released a soldier for sexual assault on a 9-year-old boy, noting in the 1864 case that anal sex was not illegal in Utah, even though a month before the Salt Lake County Court had sentenced a man to 20 years of hard labor for sexually assaulting a similarly aged girl. Homoerotic conduct was not amongst the same-sex-related charges for which any Mormon was excommunicated between 1845 and Brigham Young's death in 1877. In fact, in almost every instance, Mormon leaders who served in the 19th century were more tolerant of homoerotic behaviors than they were of every other non-marital sexual activity, for instance, including adultery. Additionally, for decades, same-sex church leaders slept in the same bed when they traveled. Same-sex sleeping arrangements were nearly a requirement for Mormon men in church leadership positions that had a lot of travel. In 1843, Joseph Smith preached, and this is a quote, "that two who were very friends indeed should lie down upon the same bed at night, locked in each other's embrace, talking of their love, and should awake in the morning together. They could immediately renew their conversation of love, even while rising from their bed." Of course, this is in sharp contrast to the strict mission rule that companions are not to sleep in the same bed. Even as late as the 1940s, the apostle Richard Lyman had an extramarital heterosexual affair, and he was punished much more harshly than when there was a revelation of church patriarch Joseph F. Smith's homosexual affairs with college students. There was a Mormon professor at Ricks College who was dropped from his held position rather than excommunicated or disfellowshipped. Homosexual acts as a ground for excommunication was not added to the Handbook of Instructions until as late as 1968. So this brief historical treatment suggests that the church's attitude on homosexual issues is flexible, and we need to be careful to presume that we have enough and that we've basically received the last word from the Lord on homosexual issues. To support that, I would quote 2 Nephi 28 that says, "Yea, woe be unto him that saith, We have received, and we need no more. For behold, thus saith the Lord God, I will give unto the children of men line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. And blessed are those who hearken unto my precepts, and lend an ear unto my counsel, for they shall learn wisdom. For unto him that receiveth I will give more, and from them that shall say, We have enough, from them shall be taken away even that which we have." Said another, and I quote, Is God inconstant, changing his mind suddenly as he goes along? Or do we change in our perception of his will as we experience evolutionary growth? I subscribe to the second position. Since the Church proclaims the importance of ongoing revelation, and since our leaders, however wise, do not claim to be infallible, the Latter-day Saints, above all religious groups, should accept that internal as well as external dialogue can contribute to advancing our understanding of the divine will. Latter-day Saints should not merely concede that God's revelation regarding moral development is unfinished, but should optimistically expect it to be continually refined. All of us have a responsibility to help prepare the seedbed of understanding for moral progress. Hugh B. Brown, he says that revelation may come in the laboratory, out of the test tube, out of the thinking mind and the inquiring soul, out of search and research and prayer and inspiration. We should be dauntless in our pursuit of truth and resist all demands for unthinking conformity. No one would have us to become mere tape recorders for other people's thoughts. We should be modest and teachable and seek to know the truth by study and faith. There have been times when progress was halted by thought control. Tolerance and truth demand that all be heard and that competing ideas be tested against each other so that the best, which might not always be our own, can prevail. Knowledge is the most complete and dependable when all points of view are heard. One of the most important things in the world is freedom of the mind. From this, all other freedoms spring. End of quote. Now, because we're a church that believes in living oracles, we don't have loyalty to what past prophets have said, which contradict the living one. And we also believe that the canon is still open. We believe that God will yet reveal many great and important things that pertain to the kingdom of God. And as mentioned before, there's little use in praying to God for truth and revelation if we place bounds on the answers that we will accept. So we have to be prepared to follow whatever direction comes, even if that means a reversal of the current church practice of fighting against same-sex marriage. And the LDS stereotypical divine command theory approach demands that level of readiness, sacrifice, and obedience, even if it's difficult. Last in this section, I would argue that the past statements, as listed in chapter 2 of my book when we looked at what church leaders have said about homosexuality, they don't necessarily qualify as the church's position. Formal positions by the First Presidency are the definitive source of official church positions, and that was from the evolution packet at BYU that came from the First Presidency. Okay, so that concludes, again, those were two reasons why, not necessarily that we should support same-sex marriage, but that we should be open to a change in church practice and or doctrine on the subject. So, we'll turn more now to direct reasons that support LDS same-sex marriage, and we'll begin the next clip with reason number 12, which is that same-sex advocates may turn out to be pro-family.